Welcome back to Silicon Wafers and our daily roundup of news, with a particular focus on the resurgence of authoritarian regimes in the 21st century, great power competition, democracy on the defensive, the Russian imperial project, and how Ukraine is leading the fight back for values and freedom. Today, we're tracking Trump's dramatic change of tone, Russia's strategic gambits, Ukraine's defiant countermeasures, and China's balancing act, and the cracks forming in Russia's war economy. We examine how these moves fit across longer arcs, across the authoritarian global slide that we're seeing, the undoing of norms, imperial ambition, and of course, great power competition. Well, let's start with Trump's shift in tone. He says Ukraine can win back all its territory. President Trump publicly stated that he now believes Ukraine can reclaim all territory lost to Russia with NATO and EU support. This is reported in multiple outlets, in this case AP News. This marks a departure from prior suggestions of negotiated land compromises, the morally vacuous and strategically unworkable land swap proposal. But is this a pivot in tone only, or also a pivot in policy? That is impossible to say with certainty. All we have to go on is his past behaviors and his words that were just uttered in the UN. Trump also labeled Russia a paper tiger and criticized Putin's war as aimless. Ukraine welcomed the change, noting the vastly improved alignment, at least in tone, but analysts caution that rhetoric is one thing. The weapons, the timing, the supply chains, and strategic cohesion moving in Ukraine's favour are entirely another thing altogether. I'll be breaking down Trump's post and reactions to it in a short episode of Silicon Bites later today, but let's dig into this speech and the post and what it might imply. Geopolitically, this commitment matters if it is, of course, sustained. It may reassure European partners, it may embolden Ukraine and shift the debates in capitals over costs and risks. But we know Trump, we've seen him in action, not just over the last few months, but in his first term as well. There's plenty of room for backsliding. Trump's prior vacillations, transactional posture, pressure from domestic politics, all of these pose risks to the continuity of what he's just said. In the narrative of authoritarianism versus democracy, this does, however, offer a reframing, democratic states asserting territorial justice, not just transactional deals. It is a welcome change of alignment. And if we take some of these words at face value, we go from Ukraine incorrectly being framed as starting the war and being the inevitable losers of it, to Ukraine being the wronged party, but now able to triumph over a weak aggressor. That is a fundamental shift. Articulation of the moral stakes is, of course, vital. Ukraine's sovereignty is not a bargaining chip. If democratic powers revert to realpolitik, then revanchist aggressors will come to dominate the political space. That is the danger we are now facing. We must watch the follow-through, however. Will there be substantial military aid, sanctions, diplomatic cohesion? All of these matter more than the rhetoric we've just heard, no matter how much it has shifted and no matter how much in favour of Ukraine. If the shift holds, it strengthens the dynamic situation acting against Russia. If these words turn out to be hollow and meaningless, it risks raising expectations without any delivery, which is an unfortunate pattern of oscillation that we've seen since January 2025. Next, let's turn to Russia's war economy, which shows new strain with VAT hikes proposed on 24th of September, but this was already circulating in draft form on 22nd to 23rd. Russia's finance ministry proposed raising its value-added tax from 20% to 22% beginning in 2026. The goal to generate an estimated extra 1 trillion rubles, that is 11.9 billion US dollars, to prop up defense and security spending. This was reported in Reuters. Other revenue measures are being considered on gambling and sectors facing less public tolerance, let's say, signaling that the Kremlin is looking towards internal fiscal stress to meet its war costs, which have not gone down. This comes against a backdrop of growing economic strain. Observers point to Russia's over-reliance on energy exports, sanctions pressure, inflation, and capital flight. Bloomberg and others report that Putin has concluded that military escalation is his best bet to force Ukraine to negotiate on favourable terms to Russia, that is. That's according to Russia Matters. But that may be a calculation based on poor information and bad strategic judgment, as well as an exaggerated impression that Putin may have of the capabilities and resources of the Russian armed forces in the field. A wartime VAT hike is a high-risk move if it hits consumers, erodes real incomes, and may fuel discontent, especially in a system that already suppresses dissent. Don't, however, expect a revolution anytime soon. It also reveals how the war is bleeding into everyday Russian life. The state now expects more sacrifice from its citizens, financial and not just its soldiers, and is more blatantly squeezing them for cash and resources. Strategically and economically strained Russia may push for escalation rather than an end to its pointless invasion. More attacks on cities, provocations, hybrid warfare, since the material options on the battlefront are starting to wane. Based on Putin's past favoured strategy of escalating into a crisis, escalating to push through systemic weakness, expect Europe to enter a new period of scaled-up Russian aggression. And internal strain often precedes external reckoning. If Russia's economy falters, escalation becomes a lever to distract, coerce, or expand the pressure, anything but face the causes of those problems, and that is Putin's war. It's also a tool of fear to try and dissuade the Western allies from further support for Ukraine. Meanwhile, the West must calibrate sanctions, support for Ukraine, and internal resilience to help its ally outlast both the battlefield and economic attrition. One thing we can be assured of, the costs of this will only rise, and possibly in a very dramatic fashion. Next, Russian drone and missile barrage hits Ukraine as Kiev strikes back on energy. On 20th to the 22nd of September, Russia launched a massive drone and missile barrage on Ukraine. 580 drones and 40 missiles struck across multiple oblasts, killing at least 3 civilians. It damaged infrastructure and stretched air defenses. That's according to Reuters. Ukraine's air defense intercepted the bulk of them, 552 drones and 31 missiles, but damage remains nonetheless. Some of the worst hit regions include the Dnipro, where 1 civilian died and dozens were injured, Chernihiv, Klimitsky, and others, according to Wikipedia. Meanwhile, Ukraine has executed attacks on Russian energy and oil infrastructure. Refineries in Saratov, Volgograd, Ufa, Bashkortostan, and pumping stations deep in Russia were reportedly hit, according to the Washington Post. Russia tends to strike civilians, of course, while the Ukrainian strikes have a strategic objective to deprive the Russian war machine and war economy of the fuel it needs. If these strategies are consistently followed and no pressure is applied to Ukraine to stop them by its allies, then it's likely that Ukraine will win eventually and weaken the Russian army to the point of incapacity. This at least must be what is underpinning the thinking behind Ukraine's strategy. So Russia's strategy: degrade Ukraine's civilian resilience, infrastructure, power, heating to erode morale and capacity as the cold months approach. This has not worked in previous years, however, and Ukraine's counter to that, stretching its reach to energy nodes inside Russia. It's not escalation, as many in the media unfortunately label it, but it is a calculated military strategy and a signal that they can hit Russia deep and hit it where it hurts. The war of attrition is, without doubt, intensifying and accelerating. Ukraine must not only survive attacks, but also maintain that pressure on Russia. The durability of its air defense, its reconstruction capacity of critical infrastructure, and external funding will decide whether Ukraine weathers the winter or is broken by it. Similarly, Russia faces a reckoning this winter with potential fuel shortages. Our next story: hybrid warfare goes further. Putin escalates the hybrid front against Europe. Beyond the battlefield, Russia's hybrid war is intensifying. The Atlantic Council's Ukraine alert argues that drone incursions, military exercises, infrastructure disruptions are part of a broader escalation. And that is exactly what I've been arguing on this channel too. In mid-September, Russia and Belarus conducted joint drills, Zapad 2025, that included simulated nuclear strikes and drone robotic training near NATO's eastern flank. That again is from the Atlantic Council. The optics of this, muscle flexing aimed at psychological pressure and probing NATO's boundaries. It is a curious coincidence, or not a coincidence at all, that the drone incursions should follow hard on the heels of this military exercise. In that context, events like drone sightings triggering airport closures in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, MiGs violating Estonian airspace, and Poland's warnings at the UN become not isolated anomalies, but signals in a broadened theatre of war. And there is Putin's playbook: mix kinetic attacks with hybrid pressure, legal ambiguity, diplomatic confrontation, increase the costs, sow chaos, shift the burden to the defenders, and of course, sow fear and confusion at the same time. For Europe, this is a wake-up call. War is no longer somewhere in the east, far, far away. It's creeping into NATO's domain. If hybrid tactics continue unchecked, the boundary between war and peacetime starts to collapse. Well, let's go through the war math, the gains, the drone numbers, and Russia's strategic calculus. According to the Russia Matters report card through mid-September, over the previous 4 weeks, Russian forces gained 226 square miles of Ukrainian territory, slightly down from the prior period, but still significant, thinks Russia Matters. But it is, of course, in an entirely incremental way. The same data shows that in 2025, Russia had launched 34,000 kamikaze drones and decoys, nearly 9 times more than during the same period in 2024. In this context, the progress is minimal when set against the vast expenditure of munitions and resources. And as per the Russian analytical report, Putin has concluded that military escalation is the best way to force Ukrainian talks on his terms, especially under conditions where he believes Washington will restrain itself. Of course, the tone may have changed, as we just saw with Trump, but we must wait to see if there's any change in the US restraint that is referenced here, that restraint that seems to be underpinning the calculus in the Kremlin. The numbers show escalation by volume, not just by selective strikes, drone swarms, saturation attacks on multiple axes. They all point to a shift from discrete operations to continuous pressure on multiple parts of the front across Ukraine, and now pressure on the most ardent and steadfast allies of Ukraine in the West as well. The territorial gains, while real, are incremental, evidence that Russia is grinding forward, but not racing forward. Does this attrition suit Russia with potentially greater human and material reserves? Well, that depends on the ratios of killed and wounded on both sides. These may well be in favour of Ukraine on some parts of the front, but this also must be seen against the deteriorating finances of the Putin regime, which creates problems in funding recruitment and keeping the war machine going. Putin's calculus must be, if force can be escalated at relatively low cost, he may hope to use pressure to coerce concessions before battlefield collapse. The problem with this logic, Ukraine is showing no signs of collapsing. We are witnessing a modern clash not just of armies, but of systems. Rule of law versus rule of force. A horizontal organizing principle, that's Ukraine, versus a vertical, Russia. Sovereignty versus conquest, democratic legitimacy versus authoritarian coercion. Russia's escalating war, its internal strains, its hybrid gambits, its arms control posturing, all reflect a regime trying to push the limits where norms once held and using lies to cover up for its systemic weakness. But the defenders, Ukraine, democratic Europe, aligned powers, face an equally critical test. Can moral clarity, moral outrage even, their cohesion, innovation and steadfastness match the authoritarian tactic of escalation? If not, we may see the slow normalization of aggression and its encroachment onto our territories in the coming years.